Okay, you all, so I'm going to try this again because today was just one of those train wrecks, technically speaking. But I thought all in all, the class was really great. And it was really great to see all of you. And I'd really like for you to take a look at this slide and be ready to discuss it next week. Um, so, beginning with this first slide, and I hope that my computer screen actually doesn't go crazy. It's an old computer, so if it does go crazy, I'll try to fix it and just, get on to it. So again, these slides were created originally by Tizero, and these lecture notes are hers. I've gone in and changed a few things, omitted some slides, included some other things, but for the most part, yeah, it's Tizero stuff. So I may have a few interruptions, and if that's the case, just you can just laugh because I'll probably have to tell my wife like, "Hey, I'm doing something here." Anyways, I asked the question, "What is an octoroon?" It's a person who is an eighth um, African American, and it's a really offensive word. It's not really used that often anymore. Uh, so the play was written by Dionysius Lardner Boucicault, um, and the dates: he was born in 1822, died in 1890. Um, and I can scroll down here a little bit more. That's the difference. Like today, I could not scroll down for the life of me. I think it was probably a setting on the actual computer, and I'm not really good with PCs. So he was an Irish-born actor, playwright, famed for his melodramas. By the later part of the 19th century, Boucicault had become known as uh, one of the most successful actor-playwright managers. The New York Times heralded him in his obituary as the most conspicuous English dramatist of the 19th century. A melodrama is a dramatic work in which the plot, which is typically sensational, designed to appeal strongly to emotions, takes precedence over detailed characterization. Characters are often simply drawn and may appear stereotyped. Next slide. Among several of the other melodramas he wrote, The Octoroon was one of the first produced in 1859 at the Winter Garden Theater, New York City. Extremely popular, the play was it kept running for years until by seven road companies. Uh, among antebellum dramas, meaning dramas about the South and slaves, it was considered second only to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a really problematic racist play. Uh, there's the next slide. An Octoroon. And actually, I realize here that his Brandon's name is actually spelled with an E, so I apologize for that. I thought it was an O, but today when we were watching the YouTube video, I realized, oh my gosh, it really is spelled with an E. Boucicault adapted the play from the novel The Quadroon by Thomas Mayne Reid. Um, so you'll notice where my cursor is here. This is where you need to be looking. This is sort of the next slide. I'm doing presenter view because then I can read the text to you and keep this kind of going. So bear with me. A very quick summary of the play. I did do this today, but just in case, for those people who didn't make it today, Zoe lives on the Louisiana slave plantation of the late Judge Peyton and his wife, Mrs. Peyton. Due to financial problems, Mrs. Peyton is being forced to sell the plantation and its slaves. Zoe is the daughter of Judge Peyton through one of the slaves. Zoe is light enough that she appears white. Zoe was raised as and grew up believing she was a free woman, but learns during the play that she's legally a slave. The hero of the play is George, the nephew of Mrs. Peyton, who visits the plantation after an extended stay in Paris or in France. George falls in love with Zoe and he proposes to her. However, Zoe rejects the proposition, pointing out that the law prevents a white man from marrying a black woman. George offers to take her to a different country, but Zoe says she wishes to stay with the plantation. The antagonist of the play, who is Jacob McCloskey, uh, whose underhanded dealings with the late Judge Peyton led to the plantation's financial problems. McCloskey desires Zoe for himself, but she rejects him. He plots to have her sold with the plantation and the rest of the slaves, and then to buy her and make her his mistress. And then the worst does happen through a series of events uh, in which include McCloskey murdering Paul, the young boy, uh, or a slave boy, or another terrible word, pickaninny, uh, with special privileges because he also is light and probably one of the offspring of the late Judge Peyton. Anyways, McCloskey murders Paul because he has that letter that would save the family from financial ruin. Um, and so McCloskey, at the end, outbids George at an auction for the right to Zoe. But eventually, McCloskey's evil doings, his machinations, are exposed, and he's killed by Wanoti, um, which is it's not spelled right on that. I'm noticing this is a misspelling. It should be Wanoti, not Wahodni. Friend of the slave boy Paul that McCloskey murdered, because Wanoti actually does see. He doesn't actually see the murder, but he comes back and sees. He finds Paul's dead body, and he puts two and two together. George is now in line to inherit the plantation and its slaves, including Zoe. However, this happens too late to avoid tragedy. Um, at least in the American stage. In the United States, the play ends with a despondent Zoe taking poison rather than becoming McCloskey's concubine. It's a little bit kind of a Romeo and Juliet moment. Just after she takes it, then George discovers her, and she dies in his arms. In the later version, in London, 2 years after the New York opening, Zoe lives, and the two, George and Zoe, vow to move to some other land where they can be wed. Miscegenation is not seen as a problem for the British audience. So, who do you think this play was written for in the late 1850s, about 5 years prior to the illegitimization of slavery? So, we have a white playwright talking about black captivity and sparking debates on abolition of slavery. In writing about black suffering, B imagines himself as a slave through the slipperies of empathy, Boucicault meaning. So in writing about black suffering, Dion Boucicault imagines himself as a slave through the slipperiness of empathy, which we'll touch on later, in which he's spending not only in which he's speaking not only for, but literally in the place of the enslaved. Next slide. In this book, Scenes of Subjugation, Saidiya Hartman interrogates what is happening when white writers talk about black suffering and argues that empathizing with the slave experience, violence, and captivity actually intensifies bondage because in order to empathize with the slave, the writer has to replace the slave with himself or herself, and thereby obliterating the slave, rendering the slave invisible, and their experience becomes universal. So it's the same time it's obliterating because it's totally erasing that experience, but at the same time it's making it universal. Like, oh, we all feel your pain. So it's really, really slippery. Really interesting work that Saidiya Hartman is doing. In doing so, the captive body becomes exotified. 3, this oddly confirms the spectral ghost character of suffering and the inability to witness the captive pain because the audience is too busy with their own catharsis. What does that mean? So basically, the actual suffering becomes like a spirit. It becomes something that's like mystified. It becomes invisibilized. It's like a ghost, and basically the the audience is so wrapped up in feeling these big emotions that they lose sight of the truth that this actually did happen to people. And so, although it seems like it might be empathetic, it actually is not, because the audience becomes so wrapped up in their own sort of feelings or big grandiose feelings, and having that moment of catharsis, which is kind of central to theater. Catharsis meaning, you get to feel something and have, cry big tears and feel terrible and feel great and feel redeemed and all these wonderful experiences of theater. But all this stuff just erases the actual experience of slavery and the violence that slavery created. So the term is called fungibility, and this is in relation between pleasure and the possession of slave property in both figurative and literal sense. Fungibility of commodity makes the captive body an abstract and empty vessel, vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values, and as property. The dispossessed body of the enslaved is the surrogate for the master's body, since it guarantees his disembodied universality and acts as the sign of his power and domination. So we talked a little bit about this today. After the slides, it kind of just went haywire, and I just kind of ditched that whole idea of the slides. So basically, fungibility, we're looking at the slave's body as just an empty vessel. Their whole experience is an empty vessel in which we can pour our own experience and project upon, therefore creating kind of a universal feeling of like, oh, look, we all feel this way. We all feel bad. We all kind of experience this feeling of being enslaved, and therefore it just totally disempowers the experience, and also makes the I really like this part where it acts as a sign of power and domination. So these are just ways in which power works. Power is very slippery, and it can become it's a really unique thing that happens here in the United States in terms of the way that power operates. Next slide. Brandon Jacob Jenkins. I apologize for misspelling his first name. It should be Branden, Jacob Jenkins. As we know, because we watched that clip, performance studies NYU graduate. His play got picked up at the Public Theater in Soho Rep. He explores what it means for a white man to personify black captivity and how that intrigued him to adapt the play. And this is actually just the notes telling me to play that clip for you, which we watched today. Next slide. The New York Times Review. There's an earnestness within this eclecticism. Mr. Jacobs Jenkins is using a genre associated with exclamation points to ask questions not only about the portrayal of race in America, but also about the inadequate means we have for such portrayals. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to reveal that this show ends spectacularly and hauntingly with all of us in the dark. As Mr. Jacobs Jenkins sees it, that's still the state of the nation. And here's another review. Yet, in its current incarnation, An Octoroon feels even richer and more resonant than it did before, both funnier and more profoundly tragic. Strange as it seems, a work based on a terminally dated play from more than 150 years ago may turn out to be this decade's most eloquent theatrical statement on race in America today. And that's, again, New York Times. So what does it mean when it says the decade's most eloquent theatrical statement on race in America today? In regards to just the use of Brechtian and meta-melodrama theatricality. So what this means is, like, if they're picking up on this idea that Brandon Jacobs Jenkins is using some European ideas around theater, mostly Bertolt Brecht. This idea of this the play within the play, the actor commenting, the actor breaking the fourth wall. These are some old ideas, but they're it seems like they're really going for it. Like these both these reviewers are like, wow, this play is so great, and they're kind of missing the point because they're looking at it like, wow, he does all this cool stuff like the meta melodrama theatricality and the Brechtian sort of uses. So in essence, they're totally missing the point. So next, so Brandon Jacobs Jenkins addresses what this means for white playwrights writing on black theater, for black playwrights in American theater today, and representations of blackness and slavery in American theater. And as we read through a little bit today, because I read that very beginning part. The beginning opens up with Brandon Jacob Jenkins, or BJJ, talking to the audience about a couple of therapy sessions that he's had, and he addresses some limitations, especially as a black playwright, in producing this play. What are your thoughts on this? That's a question that I would like to ask, that me and Tizir would probably like to ask you next week when we see you. Right from the beginning, he's breaking down the fourth wall, which is a Brechtian device, and confronting the structural violence of theater as a black playwright. That is not a Brechtian device, because I don't think Brecht was really thinking about the African American experience when he was working. Um, anyways, he also familiarizes us with black stereotypes in theater, but in condensing a 20-person cast to 16 people, he finds a way to recycle some old techniques of American theater. I think he even pushes it down even more. I think that it's actually on the cast list, it's 8 or 9 people, and a lot of the actors play the same, maybe 3 or 4 different characters, the same actor. Blackness in American theater. Think back to the first lecture where we learned about how American theater got started. It's that term minstrelsy and vaudeville, and the ways in which black folks were exaggerated, much to the amusement and enjoyment of the white audience. So, in his adaptation of minstrelsy, black actors perform in whiteface, and white men in redface, and Native American actors in blackface. It's not simply a benign role reversal, similar to the ways in which Greek and English male actors could play with gender. This plays on a meta level, so outside of the plot and so outside of social implications. It speaks to the structure of violence in American theater. So when we talk about colorblind casting and all these things, this is what it's looking at. So it's looking at some of these experiences in which, let's say you have a theater department and you've got you decide that you have 6 African American MFA actors and you've got 6 white 6 white actors, MFA actors, and you got them all together and like, look at this vision of peace, black and white folks working together, creating theater, but it's still doing violence because the refusal to actually engage in African American plays without just kind of going the simple kind of historical route. So it speaks to the structure of violence in American theater. What does it mean for black people to wear white face in American theater? He's taking a long tradition of theatricality and using it not only for artistic reasons, maybe he likes the aesthetics of a minstrel costume, but also to comment on racial relations today. In the social experiment in which people have to sit through a melodramatic minstrel show in the 21st century, what is BJJ saying about the structure of violence in theater when he has minority figures mock each other and white men? What is he implying about racial relations today? So these are some questions that you might want to think about. Next slide. Character analysis. I'm almost done. Paul and Pete and the assistant are played by an indigenous American actress, a mixed race actor, a South Asian actor or actress, or one who can just pass as Native American, and is in blackface. In this play, Paul gets murdered by a white man, McCloskey, and he also plays, the actor also plays Pete, who gets sold off to a white man. What is BJJ saying about a Native American in blackface who gets killed off twice? How does the silence read in the beginning of the play? So this is I'm looking at a very specific part of the play. If you can look on your text, basically the assistant is sitting down at the table with the playwright at the very beginning, and the playwright's like saying, "How come we can't get any more Native American actors?" And the Native American's sitting right next to him, like, but he doesn't say anything. And so this is making actually a statement on this, the erasure and the silence of Native Americans, the sort of invisibilizing of their experience as well. So the Native who plays this is like a double minority because he's Native and black, so he's automatically doomed. George, the black man, who George is played by a black man, but it's in whiteface. George is a nephew from France who is a black actor in whiteface who seemingly has all the power in the play until he gets usurped by white man McCloskey. What is he saying about agency? Fa equilibrium. So this is known as fa equilibrium, like when the black man feels like he might be established and actually gaining some kind of latitude, it's always usurped and he's always going to be pushed back. The black man can only try to become as white as possible, and in trying to suppress the authentic self from ever being black, from ever having a perpetual moment of resubjugation, he cannot escape his blackness through whiteface. Not even on stage where it's okay to pretend and forget who you are. But given the origins of theater and blackness in America, escape is not real for black people. And we see this in the choice that BJJ makes in having a black actor perform in whiteface and still end up disempowered. The Native American white man who's wearing red face is a white man playing a Native American in red face. Wanoti ends up killing McCloskey, who killed his black playmate Paul. What is this saying about Native and white relations? What is he saying about Native and black relations? So there's a couple of typos here. You'll have to forgive me. Here's a couple of terms. So this is a picture of, I think that might be Brandon Jacobs Jenkins in whiteface. So that's the beginning of the play. He's talking to the audience. And it looks like that's the playwright behind him, the white playwright. Here's a couple of terms. Again, very offensive terms. I would never go around using these in regular life. Most people our age, most people your age are probably not going to know these terms. And I don't think even people my age are not going to know these terms. That still doesn't mean that we can go around talking about them and using them freely because they're offensive. They're historically offensive. An octoroon, a quadroon, a mulatto, a slave driver, a house slave, and a field slave. And then another word that we discussed today is the word pickaninny, and that's a word that is used to describe an innocent black child who has kind of, who keeps the master entertained. Next slide. So let's move on to black femininity, consent, the idea of consent. Minnie and Dido, I did go through some of their lines. Minnie and Dido talk about sex with a master, but I kind of get the feeling like you don't really get to say, you don't get really much of a say in the matter. What is Minnie insinuating about her sexuality? Saidiya Hartman dedicates an entire chapter called Seduction and the Roots of Power. Hartman says slaves don't have consent, and their relationships with their masters aren't recognized as real. Some may argue that although slave women did not have non-consensual sex with their masters because they did not have the capacity for consent, since they were less than humans, they were sentient beings. Still, the matters of intimacy and pleasure when dealing with sex and property cannot be ignored. In other words, Hartman puts it this way: the place of affection, violence, and surrender to the law are important to explore. Next slide. In the book The Night Women by Marlon James, a novel about a group of slave women on a Jamaican plantation in the 1700s plotting a rebellion, one of the older slave women, known as Homer, instructs a young girl, Lilith, who is beginning to have sexual relationships with one of the masters. Take power over the kaki, then you have power. So that's a pretty clear statement. Next slide. Going back to this idea of the consent and bonds of affection. The tragic mulatto Octoroon. A woman appears to be white. She has suffered little hardship in her life, but upon the revelation she is mixed race, so she loses her social standing. A woman who has all the social races that come along with being a middle class or upper class white woman is nonetheless subjected to slavery. A woman who can pass for white attempts to do so, is accepted as white by society, and falls in love with a white man. Eventually, her status as a biracial person is revealed, and the story ends in tragedy. So this idea of going back, Koffel, Black Suffering, White Pleasure, the slave block. Here's a photo of the play. I think it's Dido and Minnie are being sold, and this is the auctioneer, LaRouche, and they're all dressed up. They're like, okay, yeah, we want to be sold. We want to get out of this plantation. We want to do some traveling. And of course, this is again a joke, and Brandon Jacobs Jenkins is actually using humor to really knock home this idea of the tragedy of what happened to slaves being sold. How does the slave auction block function as theater? Meta-theatrical element of the play in positioning the coffle as a form of theater. The crime of slavery is not only witnessed but staged, and thus also speaks to white catharsis or black suffering, white pleasure. Celia Hartman on Koffel as theatrical black suffering, white pleasure, fungibility, lynching. Koffel operates in the play throughout the expression of economy and pleasure, a concept of black suffering, white pleasure, which is explored in the stage directions. Girls are dressed sexy. Pete is in shackles for no reason. The intensification of black suffering, like a parody. There's one page where there's one section where Pete is being sold right before Minnie and Dido are sold, and he gets up and does a little song and dance. So what does that say about his dance? What about the section where his age is assumed that he's really old, but he's like, no, I'm only in my 40s. So what is BJJ stating about age? And that's pretty much it. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next week. And hopefully I recorded this. Please tell me I did.